Hi guys, welcome to part 2 in the building inspired by the Age of Empires 2 barracks. To start with, cut 2 shapes of foam core for each end of the upper floor building, and then with some strips of balsa wood going to build up the wooden framework. So this is reasonably thick balsa wood, and using hot glue gun we're just going to use it to build up the kind of wooden timbers that surround the plasterwork. Now we want to have recesses between these, which we're going to fill in with sculptor mod later. Now I put 2 windows on one end of the building, but I didn't do it on the other end because I'm kind of busy. And you only see it from one angle in game, so there might not be windows on the other side. And using the first one I built as a size guide, just to make sure all the timbers line up. And then for the vertical supports, just trimming them down so they fit between the existing timbers. Now, if you have any overhang, you can just trim it down. And then there are some diagonal supports, so with another piece of balsa wood, just cut the angles based on the existing geometry and glue them into place. It's up to you entirely how many diagonal supports you want to put in. They are a little time intensive and fiddly, and they do make certain parts trickier later, such as filling in the gaps in between and painting them. But using one of the end pieces as a guide, going to trim out some more foam core for the longer sides of the building, and then just doing a quick try fit to make sure everything fits. Also had a base piece of foam core just to be able to mount them on something, and then repeat the same process with the end pieces, but on the lengthwise. I find when you're gluing longer lengths together, it helps not to cover the entire thing in glue, but just dab kind of periodically along it, and that seems to prevent a lot of the warping, and it means if you do have to take it off, you don't end up ruining the entire piece underneath it. And using the measurement units on the cutting board, marking out the thirds across it, and this will be the positioning for the supporting beams. And going in from the opposite side, we're going to cut some rectangles out, and these are going to be the positioning for the windows. Then using some thin planks of balsa, we're going to cover the foam core. You can also just use some more strips to make closed windows, which I think would probably look better, but it's entirely your choice. And then going in with some more diagonal beams, just to add a bit more flair to the front panels. And on the original model, there are some mini kind of stone arches on top of the framework. So using some styrofoam, just added those on. Next, we're going to fill the areas between the timber beams. So I mixed up a batch of sculptor mod, slightly heavier on the water this time. And using this more liquid mixture, we're going to put it in between the holes and build up that plaster effect. And using the flatter side of a sculpting tool, we're going to try and get that fairly even, but it will still come out a bit lumpy due to the nature of the sculptor mold. But that does make it look a bit more authentic and rustic. So it's really up to personal preference whether you want to try and get it absolutely flat or whether you want it to be lumpier. I find that you can usually alter the consistency by breaking up the fibres before you add the water in. So if you end up getting a lumpier mixture, it's a lot easier to break it down before you add the water than it is afterwards. Then, with all 4 walls, it's time to build the building. And once that is built, we can make the roof. So, with a piece of cardboard, we're going to make sure that's the right scale and put a bend in the middle. Then, with some strips of cardboard, we're going to build up some roof shingles. So there's a few different ways you can do this, but the way I found that works is you take a long strip of card, you clip the individual tiles into it, but you leave a connecting section at the back. Then clip away the corners and add some variation to individual tiles. And then once that's done, you cut the strip into smaller pieces. Because if you keep it as one long strip, you end up with a much more uniform look. Whereas if you cut it, you can never get it quite lined up again. So you get some natural variance and it looks a bit more realistic. Or at least more interesting. Before I add the roof, I make sure the existing walls line up with the lower portion of the build. And then I add some hot glue to connect it to the base and add a bit more support. And then I set about attaching the shingles to the roof. Now, this is a great time to put something on in the background, catch up on a TV show or a podcast. And then we can add a bit more variation with some scissors. For the top of the roof, it's going to be a double shingle. So with a slightly wider piece of cardboard, we're going to score that down the middle, make sure we can bend it and it matches the angle of the roof. And then we're going to do the same process with the regular shingles, but on both sides. And I find if you do one side, you can then score lines across, so you get it lining up and a little bit of texture between the two of them. And once we're happy with that, we can glue it on top of the building. Then dry fit it, make sure it all looks good before you move on to the filling and painting. And going to mix up a mixture of fine cork, extra fine cork, and PVA glue. And this is going to be our filler. This is sort of my universal gap filling recipe. It's pretty useful, so we're going to use that to fill the gap between the roof and the walls. And we can also use it to fill the gaps on the wall sections, on the edges where the sculptor mod didn't go quite flush. And we're also going to use it to connect some of the buttresses. Speaking of which, we are going to build now, because we definitely did not forget them. So with some kind of triangular styrofoam shapes, we're going to match them to the angle of the base, glue them on, and then we're going to use a bit of the filler to blend them in. And if you want a more seamless connection, you can just use the extra fine cork chippings, but I like adding the regular size because it adds a bit more texture. So once that's all dry, we're going to prime the entire piece in black gesso. And we will also be priming some strips of balsa wood which are going to form supports and buttresses later on. And we want to make sure everything's got a nice thick coverage over everything. Although I find it's almost impossible to get 100% coverage over sculptor mod. There's always a tiny bit of white poking through. Then, once that's dry, we're going to give everything a coat of mid-brown, with the exception being the stones we attach to the base. Then, mixing up a near white mixture, just a tiny bit of brown paint, we're going to go in and paint all the plaster. It pays to be a bit more careful here because it's a little bit of a pain to get white off the timbers, but don't worry if you do, you can always just go in and repaint it later, or cover it up with an effect. Then, mixing more white and brown together into a mid-shade, we're going to paint over the timbers. Now we're mostly going to focus on the front face, but you can also use it to cover up any areas where you spilt over with the near white paint. And remember to use the same paint to continue working on the spare beams as well. And once that's dry, we're going to take a good portion of water, mix it with a tiny bit of black paint, until we have a very diluted black paint, and we're going to go over most of the model with it. This should pool in the recesses and make a nice bit of contrast, as well as adding a bit more texture as it dries unevenly. But you don't want to go too heavy with the black paint, otherwise you will darken everything down too far. You could also add a little bit of brown, and that would be a good way to tie the entire model together, just to blend all the paints, give them a nice connecting tone. And then with some grey, we're just going to patch up the stones on the base and blend them into it. Then we're going to take a diluted yellow ochre and we're going to go over all the exposed wood. And this is mostly so it stands out from the roof tiles and doesn't look too similar. But if it looks too bright, just bear with it, it will dull down later and we will be muting it as well. Then just dabbing in the grey for the stone in the side walls. Still not really sure what that is, but it's fine. Now with a large dry brush or makeup brush, I'm going to give a very light dry brush of white all over the top. It might even be better to do very, very light brown instead of white here, but it's entirely up to you. And this is just going to pick out the edging and make the individual tiles pop a bit more, as well as add a bit more colour after the dark wash. So with a very watered down beige paint, we're going to go over the yellow beams, and that's just going to tie them all together and mute a bit of the garishness. And once you're happy with the paint job, you can glue that onto the base. And then with the balsa wood beams we put to one side earlier, we're going to glue them underneath the kind of wooden rampart. And these are about a 45-degree angle sticking upwards. And then with the timber beams at the back, we're going to trim them down to size and glue them on top of the foundation stones just to support the roof a little bit more. And now we can move on to the fun part. So with very light brown, we're going to dab around the edges of the base. And this is going to be dirt and dust that's accumulated on the edge of the building. And mixing slightly darker brown in, just get a bit of variance. And with some green clump foliage, just pull it apart with your fingers until it looks right, and then glue it on with PVA. And I'm going to put a fair bit of foliage around the edge. This would also be an ideal time to use some tufts if you have some, and might be worth mounting the entire thing on another piece of foam core, make a base for it, just blend it into the ground a bit more. But I'm keeping it as is so it can be used in a few different environments. And you can also use a bit of clump foliage to fill any gaps in the roof tiles, make it look like there's some ivy or moss growing out from underneath them. And I find the best thing you can do to make rooftops look a little bit more interesting is get some fake leaves. I might do videos on these later and how I make them. But just place maybe 5 or 6 over the rooftop, and this will just help to break up the roof tiles and add a bit more visual interest. And there we have it. My finished building, inspired by the Age of Empires 2 barracks. Works with 28 or 32mm. Make sure you use a badger for scale comparison. Thanks for watching, guys. Catch you next time.